Hello there and welcome to my session for this year's Azure Back to School. In this session I'm going to be talking about the two options you have for building integration environments in Azure. We're going to look at custom integrations on Azure Kubernetes Service, which is running containerized microservices and self-managed integration tools, and we're going to compare that to the offerings from Azure in the platform as a service space. So we're using managed services like Service Bus, API management, functions, logic apps, Event Hub, and Event Grid. We'll compare these AKS and PaaS services across scalability, flexibility, ease of use, cost, security, and how well they handle the integration scenarios. And we'll highlight the pros and cons of using AKS versus Azure PaaS for enterprise application integration. As I said, this is my Azure Back to School session for 2025. If you go to the Azure Back to School website, as I hope you have already, this is day 22, and you'll see the 2025 schedule, which has both the schedule and the full list of speakers. You can check the hashtag Azure Back to School and keep an eye on your socials for that. And again, as always, a big thanks to both Dwayne and Derek for organising this community event yet again this year. A little bit about me. I'm Michael Durkin. I'm an Azure MVP based in Ireland. I'm an Azure Cloud Architect. I've also authored LinkedIn learning courses, spoken at numerous events across the world and also virtual events, and also a blogger and speaker. So let's dive in and let's take a look at why we're here. And I always look at this cartoon and smile because this is the classic Dilbert cartoon where we talk about the need and why didn't moving the app to the cloud automatically solve all the problems. And obviously we get to the end of the cartoon and we're saying you can't solve a problem by just saying techie things, and the Pointy-Haired Boss just says Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is an option, okay? It's really the emerging, I don't think it's an emerging buzzword. Kubernetes has been around for a while, and we've got Azure Kubernetes there as well, which is Azure's implementation of the Kubernetes service. We're going to dive into that a little bit now and talk through the different options that are available to us from an AKS and PaaS perspective. So first of all, let's take a look at what's available, and we're going to take a look at what is Azure PaaS. Let's have a brief overview of what it is. So Azure Integration PaaS, and there's different implementations and different interpretations of what PaaS is. So for example, you could say that there are various different SQL offerings that are available as a managed service, and they are PaaS, they are serverless, and they're all managed by Microsoft, but services like that spawned out of traditional IaaS services. Whereas if we look at the integration PaaS suite, that default suite, we're looking at the fully managed services that are available to connect applications, data, and processes that are offered by Microsoft. And just running through them very quickly. We've got Azure Logic Apps, which is our fully managed workflow service to automate processes through a visual designer. It works off triggers and a sequence of actions. And you've got hundreds of connectors available to you for systems like Salesforce, SAP, Office 365. Down then to API management, which is our multi-region API gateway service. And you can expose your APIs securely, whether they're running in AKS, app service functions, or on premises. We've then got Azure Service Bus, which is our message queue and topic broker. Okay, it supports point-to-point messaging and publish subscribe via topics, with features like, first in, first out ordering, at least once delivery, transactions, and dead lettering for errors. You've got Event Hub, and Event Hub is your big streaming data platform and ingestion service. Big difference here is Service Bus is used for discrete business messages like orders and transactions, whereas Event Hub would be used for high throughput streaming of telemetry or event logs for things like IoT sensors or application logs. We've got Event Grid, which is our distribution services, and that uses a publish subscribe model, but the difference with that and Service Bus is it focuses on reacting to events from many Azure services in near real time. Okay, it can route events to various handlers with a built-in mechanism. And instead of polling, the relevant components get push notifications. And then finally, we've got Azure Functions, which is our serverless functions platform. At a high level, Azure Functions, functions are chunks of code that run on demand, and they can get triggered by events such as a HTTP request, a message on a service bus, a timer, or an event upstream. The benefits of using Azure PaaS services, okay, is they're out of the box. You've got instant productivity and speed to deploy. They eliminate a lot of the boilerplate. You know, instead of having to write a service to poll an FTP or parse a file, you just configure a logic app trigger and actions, and you've got hundreds of built-in connectors, so you don't need to implement or code your own API calls to common services. This is all done for you. You've got managed infrastructure from Microsoft, so you don't need to maintain any infrastructure for these services. Azure will ensure that the services are highly available and patched. And then you've got scaling and resilience. So you've got that ability to have elastic compute across availability zones and across regions when it comes to API management as well, and service bus. So let's move on to what is AKS. What is AKS effectively? So AKS is a managed Kubernetes orchestration service from Microsoft. It allows you to run and manage containers using Kubernetes, but you don't have to maintain the Kubernetes platform, control plane, or the underlying servers yourself. That's all managed by Microsoft. Your infra is also managed by Microsoft. Now, you have to manage the patching and the versions that are in place, but again, all of that gets managed by Microsoft. You provision an AKS cluster with a specific number of nodes, and they're basically Azure VMs that run your containers, but the master control plane is managed by Azure, so you don't see or maintain those masters, and Azure provides an SLA for them in your paid tiers. Okay, you deploy your applications to AKS, and as you would to any Kubernetes service, and you've got full integration. So taking a quick look at the benefits, I just mentioned the full integration there with the Azure ecosystem, so you're automatically, for your control plane, you've got your security, your identity, and your monitoring is available. You've got your scalability, so you've got cluster auto scaling to add or remove nodes based on your load, and you can set that to a max when you deploy your service. And of course, Kubernetes can also scale pods horizontally within those nodes as well. You've got flexibility to run any container or any language runtime, so you're not restricted to just Azure services. You can reach out into the open source world, which is the next point there. Okay, you've got a rich ecosystem, and you can leverage tools like Helm charts, Service Mesh, Argo workflows. You've got Dapper, so you know it's cloud agnostic. So effectively, what that means, you've got the portability there to be able to move anything running in AKS to any other Kubernetes cluster, either in the cloud or on premises if you want to, and with minimal changes. Okay. Final thing there is you've got cost control at scale. So again, we're dealing with infrastructure here, and you would have heard me say the word VMs there. If you've got a consistently high volume of integration processes, running them on AKS might be cost efficient for you, because effectively you pay for the underlying VMs, which if highly utilized, can be cheaper than per action or per message cost that PaaS services can accrue. And we'll look at that in the cost section later. Let's move into scalability and performance, and let's do a comparison of both. So for Azure PaaS services, okay, when it comes to your scalability and performance, really depends on what you're trying to do. So for logic apps, your logic app is going to scale to meet demand. Okay, each workflow instance runs independently and multiple run in parallel. Okay, for consumption tier, Microsoft will just scale out your instance to meet demand. Okay, there are some limits there in place. If you're running standard tier logic apps running on fixed infrastructure, like an app service plan, you can similarly scale that to an app service. Okay, for functions, you know, same thing. You know, that's probably the most elastic of all, because on the consumption plan, a function can scale out to whatever number of instances you need. Okay, there are some practical limits on this again. And normally the instances can handle usually one or more concurrent execution per CPU. Okay, so for example, a single Azure function triggered by a service bus could spin up hundreds of parallel executors if the queue backlogs. Okay, and that's how Azure can achieve massive parallelism and get all of your different events running in parallel. Okay, We look at API management. Management has a scaling metric known as capacity units, okay? And capacity units are effectively big compute units that can handle millions of messages per second, okay? And that's what a capacity unit is, okay? It roughly corresponds to a certain number of API calls per second, okay? Normally, you can scale this to handle really, really high loads, tens of thousands per second, okay? Well, what a lot of companies do, and they tend to do, is they put in an APIM instance, and that's going to handle all API traffic across all their applications and all of their instances, okay? And normally for API management, you know, for internally, you can run that with custom domains, so your internal subscribers can get to your APIs. You can also publish them externally. Normally what you do with that is you would publish that and use API management in conjunction with something like Azure Application Gateway with WAF v2, and also you can use that in conjunction with something like Azure Front Door or Azure Traffic Manager if you're looking at kind of multi-region deployments as well. Event Grid will give you millions of events per second with low latency, highly scalable by design. And Service Bus has an option called throughput units, okay? And this is especially in the premium tier, you know, this determines capacity, and that can handle millions of messages per second, okay? And you can scale that up to, I think it's up to 60 units in premium tier, but you can get even more of those by contacting Microsoft. So you're handling thousands of messages per second by scaling up your units, okay? With AKS, we talked about pod scaling, okay, where within each of your nodes, your app is built into pods, and those pods can be scaled out horizontally as the demand comes in. You've also got cluster scaling, and cluster scaling means that you can, again, you're scaling out to add more VM nodes when the existing ones are full. Your compute capacity can grow, and that's up to your subscription limits or up to your defined limits from your deployments, but you could go from a few nodes to dozens automatically. Okay, then you've got your throughput considerations. Okay, with AKS, theoretically, because you're running effectively on compute, depending on the level of compute you're running on, your throughput limits are high. It depends on how you design the system. It depends how the network and disk performance of the underlying VMs and Azure region quotas come in. Okay, but really, if you're running on AKS, these limits rarely become an issue in practice, and you can reach millions of transactions per day if your cluster is sized appropriately. Let's move on to a comparison, but it works differently for the two different options, okay? And we're going to look at here at, we're going to start off with Azure PaaS, and we're going to look at the ease of use, okay? So from a PaaS perspective, your ease of use comes into play because, you know, it's out of the box, it's there. The system is available to you. So from your development speed perspective, okay, it's dramatically faster to build integrations using logic apps and functions than coding an equivalent solution, okay? It's a lot less boilerplate because Azure services handle a lot under the hood, okay? Let's say, for example, if a logic app fails, you know, you can just configure a retry policy in a click, okay? You then move on to connectors. There's hundreds of connectors available. If you want to connect to SAP, there's a connector for that. If you need to drop a message into IBM MQ or write to an SFTP, there's a connector for that as well. We talked about Office 365 connectors. We talked about Salesforce connectors. There is a connector for everything you need. And the likelihood is, if there isn't a connector for something you need, Microsoft are probably building it at the minute, okay? What does that allow you to do? It allows you to focus on business logic, okay? Because PaaS takes care of the infra and common patterns, your team can focus on what the integration should do and not how to make it work on a technical level. And that's especially valuable in complex enterprise processes, okay? You also got your governance and monitoring out of the box. So effectively, that's all there. They come with the monitoring tools that are built into Azure. You can send the stuff off into Azure Monitor. APIM has got your analytics to track your API calls. Service Bus has metrics and incoming, outgoing messages. So you don't have to build a monitoring solution. You can just hook directly into Azure's monitoring solution. Okay. And then because you're not managing infra, the updates and improvements from Microsoft, okay, they're going to add features to these services. Like I talked about connectors. The connectors have been steadily growing over time. Okay. You've got built-in support for virtual network injection. Okay, you've got federation token validation policies in APIM. Okay, you get these enhancements to your platform without the redevelopment. You're just focusing on the business logic, as we said above. Okay, the learning curve really, okay, is the big key thing around ease of use. Okay, it is developer friendly. It allows your developers to focus on the development and not the technical backend. What does that give you? It gives you a much faster time to value. So if you're spinning up a POC environment, you're likely to use the Azure PaaS services to quickly make that proof of concept available and see if it's going to work for you. The flip side to that, from an AKS perspective, is flexibility and control. Okay, so with AKS, you can run any service or component you want. Okay, if you don't want to tie yourself into that Azure ecosystem. Okay, and that's what we talked about with the portability a few minutes ago. Okay, if you want to use RabbitMQ instead of Service Bus, or if you want to run Kafka instead of Event Hub, okay, you can do that. Okay, if you need a customization, okay, you can use any programming language or framework for your integration logic. Okay, PaaS has constraints. Okay, Logic Apps is declarative with specific actions available. Functions support specific certain languages and runtimes. Okay, on AKS you can mix and match those if you really want to. Okay, and if you need a custom pattern that's not supported in out-of-the-box PaaS, you can write it, you can implement it. Okay, deployment flexibility. You can run this in any region. You can run it in any cloud. Or, as we're going to see later, you can run it on premises. Okay, and effectively here, infrastructure is your only limit. Okay, there's no service limits beyond the hardware. So it's whatever you deploy for your cluster nodes. And as we said, you can, based on the limits that are available to you in your subscription, you can expand on those cluster nodes if you really want. However, there is a steep learning curve, and with this flexibility comes complexity. Okay, building your own integration components means you need skilled developers and DevOps, and it can slow down initial development. Okay, you're writing code or configuring open source tools rather than using a ready-made service. Let's move into cost. This is the big one. Okay, when it comes to stuff like this. Okay, where everyone's going to say, what are your cost considerations? And that's effectively what your financial people or your leadership are going to look at. Okay, if we look at PaaS as a starting point, okay, it's new. So first of all, to come back, it's nuanced because the models are different. AKS costs are mainly infrastructure, and PaaS costs, as we're looking at here on the screen, are mainly consumption based plus your tier costs. Okay, so for your PaaS services, okay, for example, with Logic Apps, okay, in consumption, you're going to pay per action and trigger an execution. Okay, now, and some of those executions are going down to something like, 0.0002 cents per action and trigger. Okay, depends on the region you're in. That sounds tiny. Okay, we're not even talking about 2 cents here. We're talking about 0.000002 cents. Okay, but if a workflow runs very frequently with many steps, that adds up. Okay, now Logic App Standard, when you move up, uses App Service Plan or Container, so the cost is whatever compute you provision, like an App Service Plan cost. Okay, same with functions. On the consumption plan, you pay per execution and resource time used. Okay, now your first million are free, but after that, it's fractions of a cent per invocation. But if you've got a function that runs billions of times, that's again going to add up. Okay, Service Bus becomes very expensive. Service Bus is one of the big bugbears, I think, in the integration community, where you make the jump from a basic tier or a developer tier, and you could be paying 10 to 15 times the cost to make the jump up to premium tier, which you're going to need for virtual network integration, but there's no per message cost, and you've got a much higher throughput with it. Okay. Similarly with API management, you've got an expensive premium tier which gives you full VNet integration. But as I said a few minutes ago, a lot of companies just go for the premium tier and they load all of their APIs from all of their applications in on top of that, and that does the job for them. Okay, you know, an API management can be one of the bigger ticket PaaS items as well. Okay, developer tier is cheap, premium tier certainly is not. You're looking about, you know, €2,500 for your first instance, and then it halves per instance after that. But if you're running, let's say, another 4 instances, that can very quickly add up to, you know, 7,500. So, you know, it's there. Okay, it's very elastic. Okay, if you're running consumption tiers or lower tiers, you've got a near zero cost when it's idle. But once you start scaling up, it gets expensive. Okay, compare that to AKS. You've got your node VM costs, and you're going to pay them per hour, per month for each cluster node. Okay, right? Control plane for AKS is free for certain tiers. Okay, but then you move into SLAs. Okay. You've got some additional costs that are there when you get into things like load balancers, monitoring, outbound NAT gateways, things like that. They're usage based. So really with AKS, you're looking at cost predictability. It's a fixed cost model, and especially if you run it at a mostly steady rate. Okay, you can size for peak and know that that's your max expense. Okay, with PaaS, again, it depends on your tier, but it's pay as you go. So you can have sporadic integration tasks, and it's cost efficient because basically if nothing runs, you pay 0 on consumption plans. But if your usage spikes massively, the cost is going to scale with it. And that's a shock if it's not monitored. Okay, so really, PaaS is cheaper at lower variable loads. AKS is cheaper at very high scale with steady usage. Let's move into security and compliance. Okay. Starting off with network isolation, okay, with AKS, you're going to deploy it into a VNet. You're then going to have whatever form of cluster networking you're going to use. Are you going to use KubeNet or are you going to use Azure CNI? Okay, really depends on what model you're going to go for. Okay, AKS API server can be limited to specific ranges as well, or integrated with Azure AD for cluster authentication as well. Okay, with Azure PaaS, the VNet capabilities depends on the SKU choice, as I said. So you have to go to Service Bus Premium, you have to go to APIM Premium tier in order to get the full VNet integration available to you, and that's cost sensitive. Okay, from an identity perspective, you're looking at Entra. Okay, you know, Azure uses RBAC. Okay, you can restrict who can create or modify logic apps or service bus for runtime access. You can do Entra authentication using managed identities or service principals. With AKS, your access control, Kubernetes has its own RBAC that you are probably likely to integrate with Entra. Okay, but within your apps, you manage the identities perhaps via managed identities. Okay, so you can allow the pods to have a managed identity via the workload identity. Okay. Data, you've got encryption at rest in Azure by default. So whether, you know, your data is flowing through your integration services or whether it's stored, you know, within your VMs, you're always encrypted at rest. And then you bring in stuff like TLS and Azure Disk Encryption into the equation as well. Effectively, though, with AKS, okay, Azure PaaS can meet the high standards, but you've got a shared responsibility with Azure. Okay, so you have to decide who is allowed to run those triggers and what's available to you. With AKS, if you're building custom apps, it's your responsibility. Okay, and you might have to be responsible for, you know, Azure AKS will give you the tools to implement security your way, but that's going to be as strong or weak as you make it. Okay, gives you responsibility, but it's also more freedom. Okay, so we're on to pros and cons. From an Azure PaaS perspective, let's start off there. Okay, we've looked at the pros. Okay, you've got fast development and integration. Okay, that's very clear to anyone. Okay, you know, you've got high productivity, minimal code, you've got the use of all the built-in connectors and managed workflows that are there. Your developers can get in quickly. Okay, you've got low maintenance, so you've got no patching of servers or managed infrastructure, anything like that. You just focus on your logic and configuring the logic of how your app and integrations are going to work. Okay, mentioned the out-of-box scenarios. You've got advanced API management. You've got global scale. You've got reliability and SLA backed by Azure. Okay, and normally it's 99.9% or higher for most services. Okay, and then you get 4 nines of availability for stuff like zone redundant service bus or multi-instance logic apps. And then you tie into the Azure ecosystem. Okay, you've got your compliance, security, identity, and monitoring. Okay, looking at the cons that are available there in PaaS service. Okay, you've got service limits. Okay, every service has its limits. That's throughput units, message sizes, execution time limits. And if you hit those limits, if you're getting to that scale, you may need to redesign or split your workloads. Okay, some can be raised, but some are inherent. Okay, if you've got really, really specific custom needs and the connector is not there to do what you want, yeah, you've got less flexibility. You may need a workaround. Okay, not every protocol or pattern is covered here. Okay, and highly specialized integrations may not fit. Okay, we talked about the costs. You've got higher cost at scale. You're very much vendor dependent as well. These are Azure services. Okay, and there are going to be equivalents of this in other clouds, but once you integrate, you are tied into that service. There is no lift and shift available to you. Okay, the other thing you've got then as well is you've got multi-service complexity. So you need to work out if you've got a chain where you're using API management, service bus, logic apps, functions, maybe event hub. Maybe you're trying to integrate that with, as we said, app gateway and Azure front door. Okay, there is that, there is that complexity there. Okay, you need to configure all of those moving parts to work for you and work for the flow of your app, and that can become, it's a different kind of complexity. Okay, so you've got to understand how the data flows through these services and deal with these event-driven race conditions. Let's move on to AKS pros and cons. So the pros we talked about. Okay, you've got flexibility and portability. You can run any workload, protocol, or integration tool that you want, and you are not locked into Azure. Okay, you can move your containers to another Kubernetes environment if you need it, and that mitigates your vendor lock-in concerns. Okay, you've got complete control, and that's over performance tuning, scheduling, update cycles, security rules. You're in the driver's seat here. It's a unified platform, so you can co-locate multiple integration capabilities on one platform, which probably simplifies your architecture a little bit. You've got the cost efficiency at scale, which we talked about, and then you've also got, you've got a full open source ecosystem there to play with. So you can use well-known open source project, benefit from their communities, and integrate with CI and DevOps, CI/CD and DevOps tools pretty seamlessly. Okay. The cons come when you start looking at operational complexity. It is a steep learning curve. You need expertise in Kubernetes, containerization, container orchestration, and the associated DevOps. Okay. Even though Azure manages the control plane, you manage more pieces because the responsibility for apps and some infra is yours. You've got a maintenance burden there, like upgrading K8 versions, monitoring node health, scaling nodes, cluster tuning. You're dealing with complex issues. Okay, you've got longer development. Okay, you're writing effectively. If you go with PaaS and you've got a logic app, the logic app is there. Okay, it's clicks. The logic is there for you. With AKS, it's different because you've actually got to build all the integrations and you've got to build the functionality. Okay, for that, you have to build the complex workflows yourself. Okay, and that might require writing significant code or adopting a third-party solution. You're potentially reinventing the wheel. Okay, because you're looking at stuff like error handling, monitoring dashboards. So you're rebuilding capabilities that might come built in with PaaS. Okay. And you need to be careful there because your custom solution might lack some reliability features until you add them. You're limited by your infra. We talked about that. But also then there's the troubleshooting complexity. When things go wrong, your team has to diagnose at multiple layers, and that's at app, container, orchestrator, and underlying infra. With PaaS, you don't have to worry about that. You open a support ticket or you check your service metrics, and it's there. Okay. Hosting options. I like this cartoon. And of course, you can build it to whatever way you want. So, you know, the new app development, it's crucial to the future of our business. How will we run it? We could run PaaS, or we could host it on Kubernetes, or we could buy a load of hardware and run it on premises. And as he is falling out the window, the boss realizes, actually, we could fully host this in Azure, or we could run this in Azure Local, which we actually can do. Okay, you can run via the power of Azure Arc. You can run AKS, you can run logic apps, event grid functions within AKS. Okay, and that's actually nice. It's a good way to do things. Okay, you know, that's particularly if you've got geo concerns around where your data is, where your processing happens. If you're not ready to move to cloud, we've seen that with some companies before, where they're not ready for the cloud shift, and Azure Local looks like a good solution for them, not just to run their compute, but to actually run this sort of stuff as well. Okay. Let's take a look at best practices. Okay. Choose the right tool for each task. You know, often, like, you know, the hybrid architecture will work for you. Okay. Use Service Bus for reliable messaging. Use logic apps for high-level orchestration or connecting to, you know, all of those SaaS endpoints that we've got connectors for. Or you could use Azure AKS microservices for compute-intensive tasks. Okay. Avoid over-engineering. Okay. If a managed connector or a service exists, use it rather than building your own. Why would you reinvent the wheel? Why would you build something that's already there? And this reduces both code debt and technical debt. Okay. Do you need to send an email? Use a Logic Apps Office 365 connector versus writing SMTP code in a container. Okay. Loosely coupled integrations. Okay. Utilize publish subscribe to decouple events. Okay. And it'll improve your flexibility. Okay. If you look at something like Event Grid, in PaaS, Event Grid, it's a simple thing to do to just add a subscriber. It's an endpoint registration. Okay. In AKS, if you're going to use Kafka, have your microservices, don't let them call each other directly, emit events that others listen to. Okay, because it's loosely coupled, then, you know, you can make changes if you need to. Idempotency, I always get that word wrong, and error handling. Okay, integration services by their design involves retries and duplicate handling. Okay, Azure PaaS has this. Okay, logic apps can catch, Service Bus can dedupe. Okay, you know, if you're going to write custom code and not use those services, okay, use your idempotency, so the reprocessing messages won't cause any harm to your solution, and also use dead letter queues to capture failures. Okay, Azure platform, we've got dead letter queues on by default in Service Bus, so use them. Why not? Last thing, everyone hates documentation. Everyone hates it. I hate it. You hate it. Document your integration architecture. Which systems can connect via what? Perhaps, you know, use your diagrams. Azure has an integration services environment concept where you can see all your artifacts, but if you're not using that, maintain your central catalog. There's a lot of tools out there now where you can actually document your integration environments using infrastructure as code. Use them. Okay. Don't be relying on yourself to go back and integrate this after go live, because that's too late. Do it then. Do it on the fly. In conclusion, what are you really looking at here? We're looking at buy versus build. With Azure PaaS, it's like you are buying, it's like you're buying ready-made integration capabilities out of the box. Okay. With AKS, it's like building with raw materials. You get the same outcomes, but you've got more granular control. Weigh the trade-offs. Okay. Flexibility, speed, cost, skills. What's more important to you in all of those? Okay. And then find the sweet spot. Combine them. Okay. For example, an architecture with APIM and Service Bus working with a load of microservices on AKS. That could work, couldn't it? Because you're getting your premium services for your APIM and your Service Bus for your throughput, and you're combining that with your AKS microservices, which could be running logic apps, functions, event grid, who knows, okay, or whatever equivalent of those there are. So make sure that you find the sweet spot, okay, and make sure you're architecting for what you need. Every integration architecture is different. Architect for what your requirements are. Don't just stick to the ready-made services if they're not what you need. That is all from me. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you again to Derek and Dwayne for allowing me to participate in this year's Azure Back to School. You can get me on my website, any of my socials. I'm on LinkedIn, Blue Sky and X. And if you're watching this, you have found my YouTube channel, which also has the which is also called @DurcanM. So I'm easy to find across all socials, maybe apart from LinkedIn. I do need to change that. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this session, and don't forget to check out the schedule for lots more great content in this year's Azure Back to School. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you soon.